Nobody knew what Jake Morrison would do when he saw his brother's body hanging from that old mesquite tree, until the silence became deafening. The desert wind carried secrets that morning, whispering through the canyons of Broken Creek like the ghosts of unfinished business. In a land where men settled disputes with bullets and broken promises, Jake Morrison had always chosen silence over violence, patience over revenge. But some betrayals cut so deep that even the quietest soul must roar. This is the story of a man who said nothing and changed everything. A story of 9 days that shook a town built on lies, where justice came not from a sheriff's badge or a hanging rope, but from the calculated silence of a brother's love. What happened in those 9 days would haunt Broken Creek forever, leaving behind questions that still echo through the desert winds. Can silence be more powerful than any weapon? And what happens when the most peaceful man in town finally decides to speak, not with words, but with actions that would make the earth itself tremble? The sun rose over Broken Creek like a bloodshot eye, casting long shadows across the dusty main street where tumbleweeds danced with forgotten dreams. This was 1887, and the town existed in that peculiar space between civilization and wilderness, where the railroad's promise met the desert's harsh reality. Jake Morrison stood on the porch of his modest ranch house, 5 miles east of town, watching the horizon swallow the last stars of dawn. At 34, he was a man carved from the same unforgiving stone as the mesas that surrounded their valley, weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, steam rising like prayers into the crisp morning air. His neighbors knew Jake as the quiet Morrison brother, the one who spoke only when necessary, who tipped his hat to ladies and never caused trouble at Murphy's saloon. While his younger brother Tommy charmed the town with his easy smile and silver tongue, Jake remained in the shadows, content to work his small cattle operation and mind his own business. The Morrison Ranch was modest by frontier standards, a 2-room adobe house, a weathered barn, and corrals that held maybe 50 head of cattle. But what it lacked in grandeur, it made up for in honest work. Every fence post had been set by Jake's own hands, every water trough carved from the desert floor through sheer determination. The smell of sage and creosote hung heavy in the air, mixed with the earthy scent of morning dew on parched ground. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote's lonesome howl echoed off the canyon walls, answered by another, then another. A conversation in a language older than words. Jake had learned that language of silence early. Their parents died when he was 20 and Tommy barely 16, victims of a cholera outbreak that swept through the territory like wildfire. Jake raised Tommy, taught him to ride, to shoot, to read the weather in the color of the sky. But somewhere along the way, their paths diverged. Tommy had found his calling in town, working for Samuel Hutchins at the general store, then later for Judge Cornelius Wade as a deputy clerk. He had dreams bigger than cattle and dust, dreams that required connections, charm, and the kind of smooth talking that came as naturally to him as breathing. Jake never begrudged his brother those dreams. If anything, he was proud to see Tommy thriving, even if it meant they saw each other less frequently. The town embraced Tommy Morrison with open arms, while Jake remained what he'd always been, a ghost in his own story, respected but never truly seen. The ranch dog, an old blue heeler named Rusty, padded up to Jake's side, tongue lolling in the morning heat. Jake scratched behind the dog's ears, finding comfort in the simple loyalty of an animal who never expected more than food, water, and the occasional kind word. This was Jake's world, small, quiet, honest. He had no way of knowing that in less than 24 hours, everything he believed about his life, his brother, and his town would shatter like glass in a desert storm. The first sign of trouble came with the horse. Tommy's mare, a spirited chestnut named Belle, arrived at Jake's ranch without her rider just before noon. The horse was lathered with sweat, her eyes wide with the kind of panic that comes from witnessing something no creature should see. Foam flecked her muzzle, and her flanks heaved with exhaustion. Jake caught the horse's reins, his weathered hands gentle despite the ice forming in his gut. Tommy never let Belle run free. Never. The boy treated that horse like she was made of spun gold, brushing her coat until it gleamed, talking to her like she understood every word. Something was wrong, desperately wrong. Jake saddled his own horse, a steady sorrel gelding named Patch, and followed Belle's back trail into the desert. The tracks told a story of panic, deep gouges in the sand where Belle had wheeled and bolted, hoof prints that spoke of terror and flight. The trail led north toward Devil's Canyon, a jagged scar in the landscape where flash floods had carved impossible passages through red rock and time. It was dangerous country, the kind of place where a man could disappear forever and never be found. But Jake had to look. Tommy was family, and family was the only thing that mattered in a world that seemed determined to grind good people into dust. The relationship between the Morrison brothers had always been complex, woven from threads of love, duty, and unspoken understanding. Jake was the provider, the protector, the one who shouldered responsibility without complaint. Tommy was the dreamer, the charmer, the one who believed the world owed him something better than subsistence, ranching, and endless dust. In town, people often commented on how different the brothers were. Tommy could walk into Murphy's saloon and have the whole room laughing within minutes, buying drinks for strangers and spinning stories that grew larger with each telling. Jake would sit in the corner, nursing a single whiskey and listening to the conversation swirl around him like smoke. "That Jake Morrison's got ice water in his veins," old Murphy would say, not unkindly. Never seen a man so comfortable with his own silence. What Murphy and the others didn't understand was that Jake's silence wasn't coldness, it was observation. He watched, he listened, he remembered. In a town full of people eager to talk, Jake had learned that the most valuable skill was knowing when to keep your mouth shut. This skill had served him well over the years, but it had also created a distance between him and the community. People respected Jake Morrison, trusted him to keep his word and mind his own business. But they didn't really know him, didn't see past the quiet exterior to the man underneath. Tommy, on the other hand, had inserted himself into every aspect of Broken Creek's social fabric. He knew everyone's business, attended church socials, and had his finger on the pulse of town politics. He worked for Judge Wade, one of the most powerful men in the territory, and that association had opened doors that would have remained forever closed to a simple rancher. But power, Jake had learned, was a double-edged sword. The higher you climbed, the further you could fall. And in a town like Broken Creek, where fortunes were built on cattle, silver, and railroad contracts, a man could make enemies without even realizing it. As Jake followed Belle's trail deeper into Devil's Canyon, fragments of recent conversations began to take on new meaning. Tommy had been agitated lately, distracted during their weekly Sunday dinners. He'd mentioned problems at work, disputes over land claims and water rights that were getting complicated. At the time, Jake had assumed it was just the normal friction that came with any job involving politics and money. Now, as the canyon walls closed in around him and the horses' tracks led him further into the wilderness, he began to wonder if Tommy's problems had been more serious than either of them had realized. The desert had a way of keeping secrets, but it also had a way of revealing truths that civilized society preferred to keep buried. And somewhere ahead, in the twisted maze of Devil's Canyon, Jake Morrison was about to discover just how dark those buried truths could be. Jake found his brother hanging from a gnarled mesquite tree at the mouth of Devil's Canyon, his body swaying gently in the afternoon breeze, like some obscene pendulum marking the end of time. The rope was new, the knot professionally tied. This wasn't the work of vigilantes or desperate men. This was execution, cold and calculated, carried out with the kind of precision that spoke of experience and planning. Tommy's face was purple and swollen, his tongue protruding between lips that would never again charm a room or whisper promises to pretty girls. His hands were bound behind his back with rawhide strips, the leather cutting deep into his wrists where he'd struggled against his fate. Jake stood beneath that tree for what felt like hours, his hat in his hands, staring up at the brother he'd raised, protected, and loved with a devotion that transcended words. The desert wind moved through Tommy's dark hair, and for a moment, just one terrible moment, it looked like he might open his eyes and grin that crooked grin that had gotten him out of trouble 1,000 times before. But death was final, even in a land where miracles seemed possible and men regularly defied the odds. Tommy Morrison was gone, and with him died a piece of Jake's soul that would never grow back. The logical thing would have been to ride for the sheriff, to report the crime, and let justice take its course through proper channels. But Jake had lived in this territory long enough to know that justice was a luxury the law couldn't always afford. Evidence disappeared, witnesses forgot what they'd seen, and men with money and connections walked free, while the innocent rotted in unmarked graves. Instead, Jake cut his brother down with a knife that trembled in his hands despite 34 years of desert-hardened steady nerves. He wrapped Tommy's body in his own coat, lifted him across Patch's saddle, and began the slow, silent journey back to the ranch. The ride home was a blur of grief and rage, emotions warring in Jake's chest like rival armies, fighting for control of disputed territory. He'd always prided himself on his self-control, his ability to think clearly under pressure. But this was different. This was family. By the time Jake reached the ranch, the sun was setting, painting the sky the color of fresh blood. He carried Tommy's body into the house, laid him out on the kitchen table, and lit every candle he owned. In the flickering light, his brother looked young again, peaceful, like he was just sleeping off a hard night at Murphy's saloon. Jake sat in his wooden chair and stared at Tommy's face, memorizing every line, every freckle, every imperfection that made him human. He thought about their childhood, about teaching Tommy to shoot cans off fence posts, about the time they'd gotten lost in a blizzard and huddled together for warmth until the storm passed. He thought about Tommy's dreams, his ambitions, his belief that the world was full of opportunities, waiting for a man bold enough to seize them. He thought about conversations they'd never have, jokes they'd never share, and the children Tommy would never father. But mostly, Jake thought about the rope. New rope, professionally tied, suggesting this wasn't a crime of passion, but a deliberate act carried out by someone with both the means and the motivation to silence Tommy Morrison forever. The question that burned in Jake's mind like a red-hot brand was simple. Why? Tommy might have been ambitious, might have rubbed some people the wrong way with his easy confidence and quick wit, but he wasn't the kind of man who made enemies violent enough to resort to murder. He was a clerk, not a gunfighter, a dreamer, not a threat, unless he'd stumbled onto something that made him dangerous to the wrong people. As the candles burned lower and the desert night pressed against the windows like a living thing, Jake Morrison made a decision that would change everything. He wouldn't run to the sheriff with tears in his eyes and demands for immediate action. He wouldn't rage through town making accusations and threats. Instead, he would do what he'd always done best: watch, listen, and wait. But this time, his silence would have teeth. This time, his patience would be a weapon sharpened by grief and honed by a love so deep it transformed a peaceful man into something far more dangerous. Whoever had killed Tommy Morrison would answer for their crime, not in a courtroom where lawyers could twist truth into profit, but in the harsh justice of the desert, where actions had consequences and debts were always paid in full. Jake blew out the candles one by one, plunging the room into darkness. In that darkness, something new was born, a quiet, terrible purpose that would shake Broken Creek to its foundations and remind everyone who witnessed it that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one you never see coming. Jake buried his brother at sunrise on the family plot behind the ranch house, next to their parents' weathered headstones. No preacher, no ceremony, just a man and his grief and the endless desert sky bearing witness to another soul's passage from this world to whatever lay beyond. He marked the grave with a simple wooden cross carved from mesquite, the same wood that had held the rope that killed Tommy. It seemed fitting somehow. Let the instrument of death also serve as a monument to life. After the burial, Jake saddled Patch and rode into Broken Creek, not to report the murder, not to seek help or sympathy, but to begin the kind of investigation that could only be conducted by a man who understood the value of invisible observation. The town looked the same as always. Dusty Main Street, false-fronted buildings promising more than they delivered, people going about their daily business with the focused determination of ants building a hill. But Jake saw it all with new eyes now, eyes sharpened by loss and suspicion. His first stop was Murphy's saloon, where information flowed as freely as the whiskey and men's tongues loosened with each drink. Jake took his usual spot in the corner, ordered his usual whiskey, and listened to the usual gossip with unusual intensity. Heard Tommy Morrison ain't been around lately, someone mentioned casually. Usually see him in here Fridays, buying rounds and telling stories. "Probably off courting that banker's daughter from Silver City," another voice replied. "Boy's got ambitions bigger than this town can handle." Jake said nothing, just nursed his drink and absorbed every word, every casual observation, every throwaway comment that might contain a grain of truth. He learned that Tommy had been asking questions lately about old mining claims and water rights. He learned that Judge Wade had been in heated discussions with railroad representatives about land acquisitions. He learned that several prominent citizens had been making unscheduled trips out of town. Each piece of information was filed away in Jake's methodical mind like evidence in an invisible trial where he served as judge, jury, and, if necessary, executioner. Over the following days, Jake began a careful campaign of silent investigation. He would appear at the general store when certain people were shopping, positioning himself to overhear conversations. He would linger near the courthouse when important meetings were taking place, his presence so unremarkable that people forgot he was there. He visited the barber shop, where men's guard was always down and secrets spilled as easily as hair on the floor. He stopped by the livery stable, where travelers' horses told stories about where their owners had been and how hard they'd ridden to get there. Slowly, painstakingly, a picture began to emerge. Tommy had been working on something big, something that involved Judge Wade and a consortium of Eastern investors interested in acquiring large tracts of land for railroad expansion. But there had been complications, disputes over the legitimacy of certain claims and the rights of current landowners. Jake remembered now how Tommy had mentioned being asked to research old territorial records, to verify the chain of ownership for properties dating back to the Mexican land grants. It was tedious work, the kind of detailed investigation that required patience and attention to detail, qualities Tommy possessed in abundance despite his reputation for flashy living. But what if Tommy had discovered something in those records that certain people preferred to keep hidden? What if his research had uncovered fraud, forgery, or illegal appropriation of land rights? In a territory where fortunes were built on questionable claims and convenient paperwork, such discoveries could be worth killing for. Jake's investigation took on new urgency. He began visiting the courthouse after hours, using skills learned in his childhood to slip past locks and security measures. He searched through filing cabinets and record books, looking for the documents Tommy had been researching before his death. What he found chilled him to the bone. Dozens of land claims showed signs of alteration, dates changed, signatures forged, legal descriptions modified to include additional acreage. The modifications were subtle, the work of someone with access to official records and the skill to make changes appear authentic. But Tommy had been meticulous in his research. In a private notebook hidden in his desk at the courthouse, he documented every discrepancy, every suspicious alteration, every piece of evidence that pointed to a massive fraud involving thousands of acres of prime grazing and mineral rights. The notebook contained names, dates, and amounts, a complete record of systematic theft carried out over several years by people who believed their positions of trust made them untouchable. At the top of Tommy's list of suspects was a name that made Jake's blood run cold: Judge Cornelius Wade, the man Tommy had worked for, trusted, and admired. The same man who would preside over any trial involving the land fraud case. The same man who had the authority to order executions and the connections to ensure they were carried out quietly and efficiently. Jake sat in his brother's desk chair, reading by lamplight as the courthouse settled into nighttime silence around him. Each page of Tommy's notebook revealed new layers of corruption, new evidence of betrayal by men the community trusted to uphold justice and protect the innocent. Tommy had been building a case against his own boss, documenting crimes that could send Judge Wade and his co-conspirators to prison for decades. But he'd made a fatal mistake. He'd trusted the wrong person with his discoveries, confided in someone who valued profit more than loyalty. As Jake closed the notebook and prepared to leave, he heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Heavy boots, moving with purpose toward Tommy's office. Jake blew out the lamp, slipped the notebook inside his coat, and moved to the window that faced the alley behind the courthouse. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A key turned in the lock. Jake slipped through the window into the alley, just as lamplight spilled across the floor where he'd been sitting moments before. He'd found what he was looking for, But he'd also confirmed something far more dangerous. The people who killed Tommy knew he'd been conducting an investigation, and they were still searching for the evidence that could destroy them. The game was far from over, and Jake Morrison, quiet, patient, methodical Jake Morrison, was about to make the first move in a chess match where the stakes were justice itself. 3 days after discovering Tommy's notebook, Jake was feeding his cattle when he heard the sound of approaching horses. Through the morning haze, he saw Judge Wade riding up to his ranch with 2 men Jake recognized as Wade's private security. Hired guns who wore deputy badges but answered to no law except money. Wade was an imposing man in his 50s, silver-haired and distinguished, with the kind of presence that commanded respect in courtrooms and fear in back alleys. He'd built his reputation on firm justice and unwavering moral principles, but Jake now knew that reputation was as false as the land documents in Tommy's notebook. "Morning, Jake," Wade called out, his voice carrying the artificial warmth of a politician addressing voters. "Haven't seen you in town lately. Folks are starting to worry." Jake set down the feed bucket and turned to face his visitors, his hands empty but ready. "Been busy with the ranch, Judge. Cattle don't feed themselves." Course not. Wade dismounted, his movements careful and deliberate. "Actually came by to talk about Tommy. Heard some concerning rumors. Thought you might know something." The 2 deputies remained mounted, their hands resting casually near their weapons. Jake noted their positions, calculated angles and distances, assessed threats with the automatic precision of a man who'd survived 34 years in dangerous country. "What kind of rumors?" Jake asked quietly. "Well, seems Tommy might have been involved in some questionable activities. Land speculation, maybe some creative bookkeeping. Nothing definite, you understand, just whispers and speculation." Jake felt his jaw tighten, but kept his voice level. "Tommy was honest as the day is long, Judge. You know that better than anyone, considering he worked for you." "That's exactly why this is so troubling," Wade continued, his tone becoming more serious. "See, some important documents have gone missing from the courthouse. Documents Tommy was working with before he disappeared." The word "disappeared" hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Wade was testing him, probing to see how much Jake knew about his brother's death. "Maybe he took them home to work on," Jake suggested. "Tommy always was dedicated to doing a thorough job." "That's what I'm hoping," Wade replied. "In fact, I was wondering if you'd mind me taking a look through his things, just to make sure those documents get back where they belong." It was a request that sounded like an order, backed by the implicit threat of the 2 armed men who watched Jake with the cold attention of predators, sizing up potential prey. "I'd be happy to help," Jake said, surprising them all. "Why don't you come inside? I'll show you Tommy's room." Wade's eyes narrowed slightly. He'd expected resistance, argument, maybe even violence. Jake's cooperation made him suspicious, but he nodded and dismounted, signaling his men to stay alert. Jake led them into the house, through the kitchen where he'd laid out Tommy's body, down the short hallway to the small room Tommy had used when visiting the ranch. It was sparse, a bed, a dresser, a few personal belongings that spoke of a life cut short. "Not much here," Wade observed, opening drawers and rifling through Tommy's clothes with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to conducting searches. "You sure he didn't leave any work papers? Files, notebooks, that sort of thing?" "Tommy kept his work at the office," Jake replied truthfully. "Said it wasn't proper to bring courthouse business home." Wade continued his search, growing more frustrated with each empty drawer. Finally, he turned to face Jake directly. "I'm going to ask you straight out, Jake. Do you know where those missing documents are?" Jake met his eyes without flinching. "What documents would those be exactly?" "Land surveys, mineral rights assessments, historical title research. Very technical stuff, but important to some ongoing legal proceedings." "And Tommy was working on these proceedings?" "Among other things." Wade was getting impatient, his politician's mask slipping to reveal something harder and more dangerous underneath. "Look, Jake, I don't want to make this more complicated than it needs to be. Your brother may have gotten himself involved in something over his head. If he took those documents, if he was planning to misuse them somehow, There are people who might not be understanding about the situation. The threat was clear now, laid out in careful words designed to sound like concern while delivering a message of imminent danger. Jake absorbed it silently, filing it away with all the other evidence he was gathering. "I appreciate the warning, Judge," Jake said finally. "But Tommy's gone missing, like you said. Haven't seen him in over a week." Wade studied Jake's face for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception. What he saw was the same calm, unreadable expression Jake had worn for years, the face of a man who revealed nothing and demanded nothing in return. "If you hear from him," Wade said slowly, "you'll let me know immediately. This is for his own protection as much as anything else." "Of course." Wade signaled his men, who had been waiting tensely for the conversation to either end peacefully or explode into violence. As they mounted their horses, Wade turned back to Jake one final time. "I hope we understand each other, Morrison. Some situations require delicate handling. It would be unfortunate if innocent people got caught up in affairs that don't concern them." Jake watched them ride away, 3 dark figures against the morning sky, leaving behind the scent of threat and the promise of future violence. When they were out of sight, he went back into the house and retrieved Tommy's notebook from its hiding place beneath the loose floorboard in his own bedroom. The notebook contained everything: names, dates, evidence of fraud involving hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegally transferred land. But more importantly, it contained the one piece of information Jake hadn't fully understood until Wade's visit: the identity of Tommy's killer. In Tommy's careful handwriting, on the last page he'd ever write, was a single sentence that explained everything. "Judge Wade knows I know. Meeting him tomorrow at Devil's Canyon to discuss terms." Tommy had tried to negotiate with his killer, believing that reason and evidence could overcome greed and corruption. It was a fatal miscalculation by a young man who still believed in justice and the fundamental goodness of people in positions of authority. Jake closed the notebook and began to plan. Wade's visit confirmed that the judge was still searching for the evidence, still worried about what Tommy might have discovered and whom he might have told. That fear made Wade dangerous, but it also made him vulnerable. In the game of chess they were playing, Jake had just realized he was several moves ahead. Now it was time to make his final gambit, one that would expose the truth, honor his brother's memory, and deliver the kind of justice that courtrooms couldn't provide. The showdown came not with gunfire and bloodshed, but with paper and truth, weapons far more devastating than bullets when wielded by a man who understood the power of perfect timing. Jake waited until Sunday, when the entire town gathered at the whitewashed church on Main Street for the weekly service. He dressed carefully in his best clothes, slicked back his hair, and tucked Tommy's notebook inside his coat pocket, like a holstered weapon. Reverend Matthews was halfway through his sermon about justice and moral accountability when Jake Morrison walked through the church doors and down the center aisle with the measured pace of a man approaching his own execution, or someone else's. Every head turned. Jake never came to church, never participated in community gatherings, never drew attention to himself. His presence was so unusual that conversations stopped mid-sentence, and children quit fidgeting in their seats. "Mr. Morrison," Reverend Matthews said, clearly flustered by the interruption. We're always glad to see you, of course, but—" "Reverend," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly through the church despite its quiet tone, "I need to speak about justice, about truth, about what happens when the people we trust betray everything they're supposed to protect." Judge Wade sat in the front pew, his face pale but composed. Jake could see the calculation in his eyes, the quick assessment of options and escape routes. But there was nowhere to run in a church full of witnesses, no way to silence Jake without revealing his own guilt. "I think there might be some confusion," Wade said smoothly, rising from his seat. "Jake's been under considerable strain lately, worried about his brother Tommy's unexplained absence. Perhaps we should—" "Tommy's not absent," Jake interrupted, pulling the notebook from his pocket. "Tommy's dead, murdered, hanged from a mesquite tree in Devil's Canyon by men who were afraid of what he discovered." A gasp ran through the congregation like wind through wheat. Several women reached for their husbands' arms. Children looked around with wide, frightened eyes. "That's a serious accusation," Wade said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used in his courtroom. "Do you have any proof of these allegations?" Jake opened the notebook and began to read. Names, dates, amounts. A complete record of systematic land fraud involving some of the most respected citizens in Broken Creek. Forged documents, bribes, false surveys, and illegal seizures of property belonging to farmers and ranchers who lacked the connections to fight back. With each revelation, Jake's voice grew stronger, more confident. He'd spent years in silence, but now that silence was broken, the words flowed like water through a burst dam. He read Tommy's final entry aloud, the one documenting his planned meeting with Judge Wade to discuss the evidence and negotiate a solution. He described finding his brother's body, the professional knot, the new rope that spoke of premeditation and cold calculation. Tommy believed in justice, Jake said, closing the notebook and looking directly at Wade. He believed that when good people discover corruption, they had an obligation to expose it and make it right. He believed that even someone like Judge Wade, someone he respected and admired, would do the honorable thing when confronted with the truth. Wade's composure was cracking now, beads of sweat visible on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Several of his co-conspirators in the congregation were shifting uncomfortably, realizing that their names were probably in that notebook as well. "These are the ravings of a grief-stricken man," Wade declared, but his voice lacked conviction. "There's no proof that any of this actually." Jake reached into his other pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "This is a copy of the original Martinez land grant from 1847. Tommy found it in the Territorial Archives. It shows that the Rockingham Ranch, which you sold to the railroad last month for $50,000, actually belongs to Maria Santos, a 70-year-old woman who's been paying taxes on property she thought she'd lost to legal complications 20 years ago." He handed the document to Reverend Matthews, who examined it with the careful attention of an educated man. "The signatures, the seal, the dates, this appears to be authentic." "Tommy made dozens of copies," Jake continued, "hidden them in different locations around town. Even if something happens to me, the truth will come out. The territorial governor will investigate. Federal marshals will get involved. And everyone connected to this fraud will face justice, real justice, not the kind that gets bought and sold in crooked courtrooms." The church was silent now, the kind of heavy silence that precedes thunderstorms and revolutions. Judge Wade looked around the room, seeing his reputation, his career, and his freedom crumbling like sandcastles before an incoming tide. "You don't understand the complexities involved," Wade said desperately. "Economic development requires difficult decisions. Sometimes legal technicalities have to be interpreted creatively for the greater good." "The greater good?" Jake's voice carried a dangerous edge now, the accumulated anger of a lifetime spent watching powerful men abuse their positions. "Tell that to the families who lost their land. Tell that to my brother, who died because he believed in doing what's right." Jake turned to address the entire congregation. "Tommy's buried on our family plot. He died trying to protect all of you from thieves and liars who wore badges and robes while they stole your futures. He died believing that truth matters, that justice exists, that good people will stand up to corruption when they see it clearly." He tucked the notebook back into his coat and started walking toward the door. At the threshold, he turned back one final time. "I'm riding to Santa Fe tomorrow to deliver this evidence to the Territorial Attorney General. Judge Wade and his friends have tonight to decide whether they want to run, turn themselves in, or wait for federal marshals to come collect them. Either way, Tommy's death won't go unanswered." Jake Morrison walked out of that church into the bright Sunday morning, leaving behind a community that would never be the same. Behind him, Judge Wade's empire of corruption collapsed like a house of cards, destroyed not by violence or revenge, but by the patient, methodical pursuit of truth by a quiet man who understood that sometimes justice requires breaking the silence, no matter how comfortable that silence might be. Within a week, Judge Wade and 6 co-conspirators were under arrest. Within a month, federal investigators had uncovered fraud involving over $1 million and thousands of acres of illegally transferred land. And within a year, Broken Creek had earned a reputation as the town where corruption went to die. thanks to the efforts of one determined brother who refused to let injustice hide in the shadows. 2 years later, Jake Morrison still worked his modest ranch east of Broken Creek, still spoke only when necessary, still found comfort in the honest labor of raising cattle in harsh country. But something had changed in the way people looked at him now. Not as the quiet Morrison brother who kept to himself, but as the man who'd brought down Judge Wade and restored justice to their community. The town erected a small monument to Tommy Morrison in the courthouse square with an inscription that read, Thomas Morrison, 1862 to 1887. He died for truth. Jake had attended the dedication ceremony, said nothing, and ridden home to continue the work that defined his life. But on Sunday evenings, when the desert wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, Jake would ride out to Devil's Canyon and sit beneath that old mesquite tree where he'd found his brother's body. Not to mourn, he'd done his mourning, but to remember that silence and action were both tools, and knowing when to use each one was the difference between wisdom and weakness. Tommy's notebook now resided in the Territorial Archives, its pages serving as evidence in ongoing trials and investigations. The land had been returned to its rightful owners. Justice had been served, not through violence, but through the methodical application of truth, by a man who understood that sometimes the greatest courage is found in the quietest actions. The question remains, echoing through the desert canyons and the halls of power alike, what would you have done? When faced with corruption that reached to the highest levels, when confronting people who held all the cards and controlled all the rules, would you have chosen silence or action? Would you have trusted in systems that had already proven themselves corrupt? Or would you have found another way to make the truth heard? In a world where injustice often hides behind authority and truth gets buried beneath convenience, Jake Morrison's story reminds us that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun or a badge or a position of authority. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let wrongdoing continue unopposed, regardless of the personal cost. The desert keeps its secrets until someone brave enough to reveal them comes along. The question isn't whether you'll face injustice in your life. The question is what you'll do when that moment arrives. Will you speak when silence is expected? Will you act when inaction is easier? Will you stand for truth when lies are more profitable? Jake Morrison found his answer in a brother's love and a commitment to justice that ran deeper than fear. What will your answer be? That was another story here from Cowboy Soul Stories. If this tale of silent justice and desert truth resonated with something in your